Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to welcome you for this day of history. Is there anybody here who wants to introduce what we're doing? I mean, someone from the committee?
30th Saluda Celebration Committee, and this was something we felt was very important for all of us Saludians. So it's one of our first featured organized celebrations. So welcome, and thank you all for participating. I think we'll all benefit from this.
In 1882, this is the registry of members. Andrew Tanner, Isaac Morris, Andrew Guerin, Selena Guerin, Leonidas Guerin, Otho Guerin. This is kind of a family thing. James Thompson, Jimmy Thompson, Julia Dimsdale, Natalie Musser. You've got this list of folks who became certified in the church in November 1882. In 1885, Mr. Tanner deeded over this property. In I believe this is a 1936 Saluda magazine, they did a history. Reverend Akers Jr. had been the pastor here a couple years when he wrote this, and it says, the Methodist Church is the oldest in-point of origin of churches of Saluda, the date of its organization being beyond the memory of many of the older residents. The Methodist Church building is the first one built in Saluda. Though built so long ago, the location is excellent. 1 block west of the business section on Greenville Avenue, shaded by trees which keep it pleasantly cool during summer months. Our Methodist summer guests are cordially invited to worship with us, as well as others who desire to make it their church home. During the summer months from June 1 to October 1, the preaching service is held every Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, church school at 10 o'clock. Now, the history of when worship would have been changes over time, because Saluda would be a station church sometimes where it would be one pastor who would be there. At other times it would be yoked with or be in a charge with another church down the mountain, whether it was Tryon or then much later in the 60s it would be Columbus. So it was, back and forth during those years. But this history isn't meant to stop here. It's meant to carry us out. And the thing about it is, who knows how your history is going to interact with this? Before my mother was even born, my great-grandmother and my grandmother would come and be in this house. And you think about history and the history that they would have known, but little did they know that, a child of a child would come and then serve this church years later.
Glad to have you all here. I was told there probably wouldn't be many people in this kind of weather, and I'm amazed to see the turnout. Thank you. I had access to church history that was done by Maud Barber in 1989, and I'm going to use part of that. After the town of Saluda was incorporated in 1889, the Presbyterian families who had summer homes here began their own place of worship. In 1895, the church lot was given by a Mr. Legree, and the building was completed in 1896. The Popes, Robinsons, Seabrooks, Richardsons, McGowans had a part in financing the building. Dr. Pope of Edisto Island had charge of the church as long as he came to Saluda. Afterward, he turned the building over to Miss Julia K. Campbell. At that time, Mrs. Campbell was the only Presbyterian in the community. In 1914, a number of Presbyterian families making their home share permanently wished to organize the church. And for a number of years, student ministers supplied the pulpit during summer months. In April 1915, Sunday school was open for children and adults. And in 1941, 2 Sunday school rooms were built, and That's the two rooms that stick on this side of the church. Otherwise, this church is as it was when it was originally built. The interior of the sanctuary has been altered by the application of fiberboard block panels on the walls, and you can see those. But the beaded board ceiling and the wainscot survived, and so you can see the beadboard up there and the wainscot on the sides is original, and the woodwork is all original. This pulpit and the chairs behind me were in memory of Janie McCullough, and they came from the church, the Presbyterian church in Hamer, where Mrs. Hooker was from, when that church was closed.
The story of a transfiguration begins with John DeWitt McCullough. This is Mr. McCullough, born on December 8, 1822 in Society Hill, South Carolina. He died in Walhalla on January 23, 1902. The Reverend McCullough first came to Paces Gap, as the village of Saluda was called at that time, in the summer of 1880. He was quoted as saying, "I had divine services August the 22nd, a.m. and p.m., in a room over Tanner's store, congregation small. A few friends from Spartanburg present had an offering and announced that it would be the beginning of a fund for building a church. In 1880, Mr. McCullough and his sons, plus a group of young students from Sewanee, started building the church on land donated by Mr. Frank Thompson. Eunice Pace remembers her father telling her that when he was a young man, he helped to build the pews. Elizabeth Cooper Neighbors once told Eunice that her uncle, Frank Arthur, had carved the rood screen, and it was later moved to the walls on either side of an altar. It was said that in later years he carved the doors for St. John the Divine in New York City. Johnny Kennard made and carved our prayer desk from Carolina hemlocks. Robert Burt writes that the church pews were hewn out of dead chestnut trees, and that the altar was carved out by Mr. McCullough, and the rados and the lectern top was made from Mr. McCullough's mahogany dining table, which was broken on a trip up the mountain from Spartanburg when it fell off the wagon. In 1920, Reverend McCullough's daughter, Phoebe Stanton, created a plan for the memorial garden in the churchyard, using different flowering plants to form church symbols at the points of the compass. Julia Galat, deaconess and sister of Dr. E.B. Galat, a pioneer doctor of Saluda, was instrumental in obtaining some of the windows by asking friends for their donations. Our bishop's chair, which is in this corner, is a memorial to William Bell Howell, 6th Bishop of South Carolina, 1871 to 1894, and it's probably the only bishop's chair in North Carolina with a South Carolina bishop's name on it. I would like to remind you of the importance of preservation. One of the things is that Reverend McCullough built 20 churches. 11 are gone, and the ones that remain have changed, sometime sympathetically, sometime not. One ended up in a trailer park as a storage. One became a storage for hay. Transfiguration has changed very little, and we need to make sure it remains.
This building is not the original building, and I'll get to that in just a few moments. All the other churches we've been in are the original ones. The original building is standing, but since it is a private residence now, I don't think we'd have permission to go in and look around. But after the town of Saluda was organized in 1881, the need for a Baptist church was soon recognized. One Saluda resident, Mr. Ransom W. Pace, had for some time desired to bring a Baptist church to this town. During the summer of 1888, A revival meeting was held and led by Elder Blythe and Reverend J.A. Stanton. Out of the revival meeting came the charter members, and Mr. Pace donated the land for the church along with $100 for the first building. On June 15, 1888, the church was officially organized. The original construction and church minutes are on display in this case. The minutes actually had also been lost for a while. Robert Pace found them, I think, upstairs in the building several years ago and brought those back to the church. Let me just make mention of this right quick. There are a few things we don't, since we're not in the original building, I brought a few things out for you to look at. The original altar, or the altar table for that came out of the old building, is also up here. Read very closely the words, in remembrance of me. It was spelled wrong. That's all right. Soon after the church was organized in 1888, the need for a building led to construction of the first building. The original building was built by 4 church deacons and was dedicated on October 31st, 1894. The dedication message was preached by Elder Blythe while seated in a chair due to his illness, and that message was the last that he preached. In 1923, the church purchased the land on which the present church now stands. The land was purchased for a sum of $2,000. Because of the gradual but steady growth of the membership, the members voted in 1952 to construct a new building on the land that had been previously purchased. A groundbreaking and dedication ceremony was conducted on October 9th, 1955. And if you look at this picture right here, this is the date, October 9th, 1955. This is at the ceremony. And I would invite you to come and look and see if you recognize any of the folks in this picture. The building was completed and dedicated on October 28, 1956. On July 28, 1960, the church borrowed $25,000 to begin construction of this sanctuary. The sanctuary was completed the next year and dedicated February 5th, 1961. Since the establishment of the church in 1888, the church has had 29 senior pastors, including myself. That's not including interim pastors. One of the most interesting things that I came across, before I say this, is anybody related to Pastor Blythe? Okay. He was 79 whenever he became pastor of this church. His wife had died. His first wife had died just a few months before the church was established. And about 2 years after he became pastor, he married again. The church apparently approved this because he continued to be the pastor for several more years. But he was 81 at this time. What was interesting was the age of the lady he married. 26. I just thought that was very interesting.
I'm not the oldest member of this church, although I'm the one that keeps up with the history of the church, and I've always loved the church and the past history. One of the reasons that I like it, my family, down through the years, from the first Russell that came to Henderson County, down through now, there have been people in this church that were Russells. Mountain Page Church actually started on a little hill, a log church, in a community down Old Mountain Page Road. There's a cemetery up there with probably 75 to 100 people buried in it. Most of them just have field stones. The reason that we have this community here, we are where the old Buncombe Turnpike came through. They had the log church over there. The log church burned. So they went up on the hill and built them a little frame church. And sometime about 1800, there was a dispute in the church about the preaching of predestination. The church split up and came up here. Well, there was some man by the name of Page, and I can't find him in any of the minutes of the church, donated this land to build a church. But after that church, the log church burnt, they built a little frame church. And then they came up here and built a church over here that sit facing this way. And I have pictures of it here propped up with poles. My grandmother and my grandfather in 1938 were the last people buried that they held their funeral in the old building that was here. This building was started in 1936, and they built it out of rock because they didn't have any money to buy material with, so they started out of rock. They built this church with hand tools. This church was not finished till in the mid-40s after the Second World War because they didn't have the manpower to finish the church. Mr. Revis, he was the rock mason who built this church. Now, he had other people to help him, that's for sure, but they built scaffolds up around the inside and on the outside, and these walls are about that thick. They're about 2 foot thick. Mr. Revis died quarrying rock to finish this church. He had a massive heart attack and died. Power came to this church in about 1950. Up until that time, they had 4 wires, one down, staggered along, and one up here. And they had certain people who had the responsibility of a Coleman pump-up lantern. And you pump that lantern up, and you come in, you hung it up on the wire, and the preacher didn't have to look at his watch to know when to quit, because when the lights started getting dim, his hour was up. His hour was up.
I'm Bill Halbert. I was raised up in this church. The only church that I've ever belonged to was right here. Still here. This church was established in 1834. The old building was right across the road, they say, and for years it was used by Methodists and Baptists both. Methodist preacher one time and a Baptist preacher another. That went on for years, they say. This book right here we've got now started in 1906. And the first preacher in this book was Reverend John Aldridge from the lower end of the county. He pastored this church from 1906 to 1924. Then he resigned, and about 2.5 years later, he came back, and he pastored this church till he died in 1933. And there's several pastors in between here. Then we got down to 1964, and Brother Henry Vector come here, and he's still here. We can't get rid of him. Don't want to. But anyhow, this was the second oldest church in Saluda Township. Mountain Page is number 1. We don't know who started this church, but I was told one time by Reverend George Jones, the historical man in Henderson County. He told me that a bunch of men out of Mountain Page came to this church, and with the men of this community right here, formed this church in 1834. There's some old graves going down the hill on the other side of this hill in the woods, that there's some tomb rocks in that part of the old cemetery down there that is hand engraved in the late 1700s. And they say there were some Indians and also slaves buried down in that part of the church. That when this church was formed, this was Howard Gap, the only road from the flatlands to the mountains. And this was the only road down into Spartanburg or anywhere in the flatlands. We have a picture of the old original church here. We're in the old original church, but it's been built around it. The old hull is still here. I think this building here was built in the early 1900s. And when I was a boy, there was a big old pot-bellied stove right along here in the middle of this wall right there between those windows. It had a big sandbox around it. And the old-timers chewed and spit tobacco juice right in the sandbox. And people came with mule and wagon Years ago, there was a huge white oak tree right there in the parking lot. And there, when I was a boy and Lloyd was a boy, there's horseshoes all around the side of that tree where they tied their horses to. You remember that old big tree, Lloyd? Back then, the only musical in this church was a big old-time pump organ. I know a lot of you have seen or heard of them. She played that organ here for years. Miss Tessie Forrest, lady never was married. She's still Miss Forrest when she died. But she played that old pump organ here for many, many years. But we're thankful the Lord let us be here. Okay, I'm finished.